We have a young man in our community that you're going to meet tonight who is doing a lot of interesting things. He's very involved with the book E2 101 that many of you may be tapping into. He's become a mover and shaker in the community. He's doing video programs on metaphysical people and metaphysical organizations for cable television called One World. And he and himself, of course, like all of us, has gone through some major transformations. And he's going to share that experience with you tonight as the stripper. I want to introduce to you Bruce Benefiel.
Good evening. Well, these lights are a little bright. I'm not used to being up here on a stage. To begin with, to explore One World a little bit, Luis and Chia's son were the guests on the show this last week. The focus of it is to explore the fears that we go through in common and to provide a format so that we can at least see ourselves in others and the fears that we have to go through and release and move on. The book E.T. 101 came to me through some very unique ways several months ago, and as a result of that, I'm here this evening after appearing on Lewis's radio show 1st of January. But to back up from that a little bit, as you can see, I'm dressed rather conservatively this evening, and that's all as an example of what I've been through. As a child, I grew up in rural Indiana, and as soon as I knew, or was able to know anyway, my parents informed me that I was adopted. And I didn't think much about it until I was 6 years old, and I was standing in front of a window one night waiting for my father to get home, and I heard this voice say, "Hey, you!" And I'm looking around going, "What's going on?" And I turned to my mother down at the bottom of the stairs, and I said, Mom, do you hear that voice?" She says, "No, what voice?" I said, "That voice." It says, "Hey, you." She said, "I didn't hear any voice. Must have been a peeping Tom." And I'm like, "Well, okay, I suppose, but gosh, it was so loud." And I kind of blew it off a little bit. But that was my first experience. From the time I was about 8 to 10 years old, we had moved into a new house, and I used to get up in the corner of my bedroom at night and watch myself laying in bed, and I'd watch myself get out of bed and climb out my bedroom window and walk out into the field next to the house and rise up into what appeared to be an orange cigar-shaped cloud. And it was a very neat experience because as soon as I would get to the cloud or the perimeter of it, I would wake up the next morning in bed and feel fine. I really didn't think anything more about it. Until in my 20s, I found out that the cloud was one of the most common UFO contactee experiences. That kind of unsettled me a little bit because it added more pieces to the puzzle that I was already experiencing. As a teenager, I went through a lot of different modalities in searching for truth and figuring out what I was here to do. And one of the things that happened to me at that point in time was I went through a very emotional experience coming out of high school and moving into college initially. I had gone back after quarter break and decided I was going to ask a girl that I had dated to marry me. Well, I went back and went out to her house to talk to her, and come to find out she'd gotten married a month earlier. So it was very much of a shock, kind of took my heart out and said, throw it away. So I got back to school and I thought, well, gee, I really don't know what to live for. So I got down on my knees and I prayed and I said, "Father, show me what's truth, and I'm willing to die for it." And several weeks after that, I was in meditation, and through that meditation, this voice that I'd heard since a child came to me and says, "Bruce, are you willing to die for what you believe in?" And I said yes, without any hesitation. And it just so happened I was listening to some music at the time that facilitated an out-of-body experience. And I was taken out of body into the most beautiful, glorious white light that I have ever experienced. And then went on from there to be informed essentially of what I'm here to do, which is a little lengthy to get into here this evening. Once I got out of college, I did eventually get married, and we moved out here about 10 years ago. Through my efforts at being a family man, supporting a family, and getting into the corporate world, which supposedly was going to bring about happiness and success because I was following what I should do in the world as opposed to what my heart was dictating. Well, what happened was I eventually ended up going to work for an aerospace company and started working 60, 65 hours a week and was going to school. And in efforts to finish my degree, because I had not finished it before. Well, what that did is it took me away from my family, and I found out that through all of that, it was something that really brought more separation and eventually the demise of my family. Bring this up a little bit here. So anyway, what I had learned through that experience was that in order to fully connect, sometimes we have to release what happens. What eventually did happen, so I went through a divorce, and within 2 months, my ex-wife and 4 children moved back to Indiana. That was enough of a pull from my heart. A couple of weeks later, I ended up losing my job. So it was like slaps on both sides of the face and a kick in the butt at the same time. So what happened was I decided to start following my heart and following what was in it and looking for ways of connecting from a heart level through business. I was also a musician, or am also a musician, so there's a lot of connection there. And being able to connect at that level, I think, is one of the most important things we need to do. But to get there, we first have to go through some dysfunctional patterns, because this world is based on that. We all work within those seemingly dysfunctional patterns with the pseudo-success or the security that we feel in a job or a place or a thing rather than what's internal. So what we do is we build up like a coat of armor. And in order to work through that, we have to be willing to remove that coat of armor. And so we have to understand that that coat may be weighty, but it must be removed. Now, once we let go of that, we find that we have a lot of vested interests. And those vested interests may come in a job, may come in modalities that we feel is providing wholeness in our lives, somewhat disjointedly at times, but nevertheless, those are vested interests. So in order to move out of that and move into more of a way that flows, again, from the heart, now this is something that many of us understand what that is, and especially those that have been involved with meditation and listening to what those inner promptings are. It sometimes comes as a still small voice. And I think recently, as Luis was mentioning earlier, there's been some weird stuff going on. There's been a lot of people going through a lot of growth and becoming responsible and accountable for a lot of the things that have come up. And part of that is becoming balanced and being responsible for taking care of business in the real world. But because of that, we have to learn that in order to become responsible, we first have to divest ourselves of those things that get in the way, such as our own minds, for instance. We come to the point where we have to realize that in order for us to become more functional, we have to deal with those knots and that feeling of being all tied up inside and feeling like we're led around from one thing to another, and having to realize that we've got to disconnect from that. And in order to do that, we have to work on those knots inside, whether that's through co-counseling or through whatever modality of healing or therapy. We first get in touch with those knots and then begin to remove them. And by removing those knots and opening up ourselves, we become more functional, and we become more whole and more aware of what's inside. Thank you. Again, I'm a little bit nervous up here because I'm not used to being in front of people up on a stage. I'm more used to being down at ground level and associating with people. It's kind of hard for me to see people with the lights in my eyes. Then what we go through is realizing that, sometimes we kind of walk around in a lot of muddy water, or we walk around in a lot of murk and mire and things, and we're not really getting in touch, or at least being able to get in touch with what's going on at ground level. So what we need to do at that point is get rid of those waders. And sometimes that can be some pretty thick boots. Thank you. So first of all, yes, I'm a little colorful. By getting rid of those, we can connect with what's going on at ground level and actually get back in touch with a lot of what we know as earth energies, and being able to connect with what the Indians call the rainbow people. Which are those who make up all races, all creeds, all colors, and one family. In our spiritual progress, we get to the point where we feel like prosperity is not worthy of our being. And I think a lot of us have experienced that, because in those patterns, those dysfunctional patterns, we've thought that we've had to reject the very systems that are available here. And in reality, what we need to do is go back in and work in them. We have the abilities to do that. But before we do that, we go through a period of feeling like we have to give the shirt off our backs to people, which is okay, because it brings out the true color that's in our hearts. Thank you. Are we enjoying things? Yes, less is more. Once we're able to realize that we don't have to give the shirt off our backs, it's nice to give. To be able to give from our hearts and from the center of our beings is one of the most important things that we are able to do as spiritual beings, as multidimensional beings. And I'll discuss multidimensionality in just a bit. But in doing that, and getting in touch with being able to give, sometimes our egos get in the way. And especially from a male's perspective, we have to first learn about our emotional side. Now, being a quadruple Cancer, I've felt things since a child, and a lot of times I rely on my feelings. Sometimes I get back up here, though, which I think a lot of us do. We get back up in our minds and our intellect. And one of the things that I learned when I was in college the first time, I just happened to look up a word that a lot of people seem to have problems with, and that being Satan. Now, why I was looking it up in this huge dictionary at the library at the university, I didn't know, but I just felt compelled to look it up. Well, what I found out was, at least in this dictionary, one of the bases of the word comes from a Greek word, thetan, T-H-E-T-A-N, and it means thinker. Well, that makes sense. When we're up here, we've got duality, right, wrong, good, bad, white, black. we don't know how to focus in the heart and work in oneness, which is truly what we're here to do. Again, being one people, one planet. But from a male's perspective, I had to come to terms with, okay, now, am I really comfortable with wearing the pants in the family? And yes, to a certain extent, I am comfortable with wearing the pants. However, it's like judging a book by its cover. That's not always what you see inside. So what I felt was necessary was at least getting rid of the pants and having something just a little bit more connected. So by doing that, we kind of make the shift to the more creative side. And this is kind of an example of going from one extreme, the traditional business attire, to the other extreme, the very creative end of it. And by doing that, by going to the other extreme, that's not always healthy either, because we get into the perspective of thinking everything is la-di-da and all woo-woo and not being grounded. So then what we need to do is put a different pair of shoes to walk the path with. So by doing that, I'm going to sit down while I do this so I can put my shoes on. By putting shoes for a new path on, then we can take that energy from our creative side and learn how to channel it back in to appropriate areas that bring about the joy and happiness that we were truly brought here to be able to experience. And by retying those laces of errant thinking, so to speak, and getting our minds back in order, in alignment with the heart, then we're able to come back into proper perspectives and work within the community on various projects, or to come and gather together in groups like this and to be able to share things and to be able to learn from others about their experience and what is appropriate and how we can grow together as a community. There's several things that we can each do. First of all, we have to be able to connect at our own heart levels and then find something within the community or within the city, state, nation, or whatever we see needs to be done is oftentimes what we need to be doing. Sometimes it's hard to jump out there, but by realizing that we have all the access necessary to everything that we need, this gets into the area of multidimensionality, as I mentioned earlier. That's kind of a buzzword these days, and not too many people in the mainstream area understand what that word is. And I think sometimes maybe us in the metaphysical community don't really understand what it is either in its fullness. Because we are functioning simultaneously on many different levels all the time. As an example, we've got 5 senses. This is looking at it from a scientific standpoint without understanding the 6th, with roughly 10% of our minds, or use of our brains. Now, is it possible that we could have as many as 54 more senses with the other 90% of our brain? I think that's probably the case. And as we become more aware, we become more in touch with those senses and are able to use them. Sometimes we don't always listen. I wanted a real-world example to be able to give to you about that. I didn't know it was going to come in this particular way. Again, being accountable and having to be responsible for our own actions here. Yesterday evening, I was on my way to playing a gig that we had. I play in a reggae band also. And I was on the way to the gig, and all of a sudden I look in the mirror and I see police lights flashing. And I'm thinking, oh no. Because the vehicle that I had gotten, I'd been a little bit in financial precarity recently. And so what I had done is I'd cut some corners and had done some things that weren't really in line with what rules I needed to go by. So what happened was I got my plates confiscated. And I got 3 tickets. Now, that's a perfect example. The only thing that happened earlier, talking about the senses, is I had gotten the impression to have my significant other drive earlier in the evening, and I did not expect her to drive because I had to pick up my gear afterwards, and I just kind of blew it off. But I still got that subtle hint. I didn't pay attention to it. And because of that, I put myself in a place and, kind of got slapped around a little bit. Now, I'm sure I'll be able to deal with that. I have to now. I don't have a choice. I got a choice. I could always leave. However, by doing that, it may, again, provide many opportunities for growth, not only for me, but to be able to connect with other people, and who knows what doors may open up. By viewing it in that way, it's a much more constructive perspective of the crap I got to go through by the mistake that I made. And I think all of us can use that as an example. I mean, I'm not anyone in particular, and I'm not special in that way. I think we've all got that ability. We're all special inside. We all have that point of light in our hearts. We all, again, need to come back and realize that we're functioning in this world. It is a 3-dimensional world. We're bringing other dimensional consciousness into it, yet it's still something that we have to learn to live with and live within and do the work that's necessary within those specific guidelines. Now, we can call on a lot of other things and get the help that we need if we listen. But if we don't listen, how can we expect that need or those things to be supplied to us in the future? I'm saying that as much for my benefit as for anybody's. But by doing that, we are able to connect. Now, excuse me, I have one thing to put back on. A lot of us keep reminders of the different modalities that we've come from or things that we hold dear to our hearts. One of the things that I use is just a cross, but it's part of the package and part of the uniform, if you will, of being a wild and crazy guy, But a lot of us have signs and symbols and things in our homes, on our persons, that we connect with. Those are good. Those are wonderful. Don't get stuck in the outside, though. Realize that all we have, the truth that we are, is all inside of us. We all have that ability to listen. We all have that ability to connect. And we all have that ability to love and to be loved. And with that, I love you. Namaste.